In this lecture, I'll show you how to enable SSH on a Cisco router. I've created this simple topology with only one router and the cloud, which is in fact my Windows recording machine. There's also a layer 3 connectivity between the Windows, which will be the SSH client, and the router, which will be the SSH server. Let's test the layer 3 connectivity between Windows and the router. I am pinging the router. And it's working. Let's start with a basic SSH configuration. We'll enable SSH on the router. At this moment, SSH is not enabled on the router. We can see that port 22 is closed on the router and it's not possible to connect to the router using PuTTY and SSH. Let's see if port 22 is open. And I'm using the telnet command. Telnet, the IP address of the router, and the port 22. And we see that the connection failed, and that means that the port is closed. I'm opening a console connection to the router. The first step is to configure a host name. I am entering the global configuration mode and I am executing the command hostname and a name. Let's say R1. Anyway, the host name was already configured. But configuring a hostname is mandatory for enabling SSH. Good. The second step is to configure a domain name. IP domain name and any domain. Domain.com. Next, we'll enable the SSH daemon, which also means generating an RSA key pair on the router. Crypto key, generate RSA. Choose a key with a length of at least 2048 bits. If you go with the default, which is 512, it won't work. The client will not authenticate to this server with such a short key. So the key will have a length of 2048 bits. SSH enabled. And I enable SSH version 2. IP SSH version 2. Perfect. Now port 22 is open on the router. Let's check it again using the telnet command. And we notice that it has connected to the router. The next step is to configure the VTY lines to accept SSH and local authentication. Local authentication means that the users are defined locally on the device. It's not running a Radius or a TACAX server. So line VTY 0 and 4 transport input SSH. I can also allow telnet or not. If I add telnet, telnet will also be permitted on the device, and if I don't add telnet, I can connect only using SSH. Let's allow both SSH and telnet. And login local. Okay, that's all. I've enabled SSH on the router and the default authentication method is using the password. Let's try to connect to the router using SSH and PuTTY. I am opening PuTTY. The IP address of the router 10.1.1.10. The default port is 22, SSH, and open. And it's working. There is already a user configured on the router, U1, and the password is Cisco. Perfect. It's working just fine. You've just enabled SSH on the router for remote management.